Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 4 of Bullseye. It's great to be back with you. We've got a very, very impressive show lined up for you today. Johnny Larder, great to have you back on.
Oh, thanks, Uri, and thanks for everyone watching.
And our special guest today from the United States, native of the United Kingdom, is Dr. Andy Wakefield. Andrew, welcome to the program. It's great to have you with us.
Great to be on, Graham. Thank you so much.
Before we unpack your story, let's roll a clip from Sky News presenter Andrew Bolt here in Australia, which shared in the last few days, which necessitated our call to get you to come onto the program. Let's roll that clip and get your thoughts on it.
Donald Trump picked some wild people for his administration. One is his health secretary, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who's now persuaded the president to limit vaccinations of children and separate vaccinations of measles, mumps and rubella instead of giving the 3-in-1 shot that's also given to children here. Maybe that's good, maybe it's not. But then Trump repeated the line, long pushed by Kennedy, against the medical evidence that there was a link between vaccinations like that and autism.
Decades ago, children received only a small fraction of the vaccines required today. In those times, people were much healthier, and of course, the high rates of autism now observed did not exist.
This is just crazy and dangerous. I mean, this conspiracy theory that vaccines caused autism in children, that made big headlines in 1998 when the Lancet Medical Journal published a paper by 13 doctors and scientists making that link with the triple vaccine. But the lead author, Andrew Wakefield, turned out to have cherry-picked data, even fake data, failed to disclose huge vested interests. The $1 million have been paid by lawyers, for instance, to prove that link. The $50 million a year he expected to earn with his own diagnostic kit for the fake syndrome he claimed to have discovered from all this. 10 of his co-authors then retracted their support for their own paper, which was then pulled by Lancet. And Wakefield was struck off as a doctor for falsifying evidence. But the damage was done. Vaccination rates in Britain and the US fell, measles among children rose, and children died. But Wakefield, he just moved to America, still claiming innocence, and made a film promoting his discredited claims, widely and wildly discredited claims.
Andrew Bolt went into a character assassination of you, which I know doesn't faze you because you're used to that. And you know, in a way, I did a lot of work on this interview yesterday. And we had a Dr. Ros Jones, who was a paediatrician from the UK who retired several years ago, who came out and apologised to you at an event in the UK, having bagged you considerably for a number of years. She actually said she believed from the work that she'd done in paediatrics for 3 or 4 decades that you were actually right. And when you Google your name, you've got to really mine hard to find information that supports your claims and actually makes you look more relevant than the mainstream would have you look. So we're really interested to unpack this because the revelations out of the COVID mandates and the implementation of the COVID vaccines has brought everything back. And from my perspective, I had a 3-year-old granddaughter who had the MMR shot, as well as a cocktail of other shots on a particular day. And she was suffering fits on a regular occasion for about 18 months. It was pretty dire. So the relevance of the things that you've been doing in the course of your career are more prominent now than ever. So I'd love you to unpack how you got to the point where you went from hero to zero in 10 seconds flat.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I graduated in medicine in 1981. And I was an entirely mainstream physician. I trained as a surgeon in gastroenterology, gastrointestinal surgery. My specific interests were Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis, inflammatory bowel disease, epidemic diseases for which the cause was unknown. And I ran a research team at the Royal Free Hospital in London. And in 1995, mothers started contacting me saying, my child was absolutely fine, perfectly normal, developmentally normal, interacting with their siblings, speech and language were developing. They had their MMR vaccine in many cases, and then they regressed into autism. And I said, stop. I'm sorry, I know absolutely nothing about autism. I'm a gastroenterologist. And when I was at medical school, it was so rare, we weren't even taught about it. And they said, no, the reason we're calling you Dr. Wakefield is that my child has intractable gastrointestinal distress, bloating, alternating constipation and diarrhea, failure to thrive. They're in pain. I know they're in pain because I'm their mother. I know, even though they've lost the ability to speak. And the symptoms they described were reminiscent of inflammatory bowel disease. And so I put together an outstanding team of physicians, including John Walker-Smith from Australia, the world's leading pediatric gastroenterologist at the time, and his team, psychiatrists, neurologists, and we investigated these children. And lo and behold, the parents were absolutely right. The children had an inflammatory bowel disease. I didn't diagnose it. The person doing the endoscopy, the colonoscopy, diagnosed it. The pathologist looking down the microscope diagnosed it. But somehow I was accused of fraudulently misrepresenting the findings, even though I did not make the findings. And so we published this paper. And I thought to myself, you know, if I'm going to get involved in this fight about the vaccine, because we had an absolute moral obligation to look at the vaccine. The parents had been proven right on the link between the bowel disease and the autism. What was going on with the vaccine? We had an obligation to investigate that. And so we did. And that's really when the heavens opened. And I wrote a 250-page report to myself looking at every pre-licensing safety study for measles-containing vaccines, single measles, measles, rubella, and the MMR, measles, mumps, rubella vaccine. And the science was not there to make the case that they were safe. It wasn't there. And I'll come back to that in a minute. But what I did when we published the paper on this, and there was absolutely no fraud, the commentator on the news was absolutely wrong. My colleagues did not back away from any of the findings they had made. They stood by and still stand by the clinical findings in those children. That is false, as so many things about this story are false. And there was no fraud. That was an allegation made by a journalist who had no medical training, funded by Rupert Murdoch. And I gather that that program that voiced this is also a Murdoch-based program. And the conflict of interest there is Rupert Murdoch's son, James Murdoch, was on the board of GlaxoSmithKline at the time, the major manufacturer of the MMR vaccine, with no disclosure of that conflict of interest by that news reporter, at least that I saw or heard. So I asked in the press release, the press conference that came from that, organized and required by the dean of the medical school, not me, I said I would recommend that parents opt for the single vaccines which were available at the time until the appropriate science has been done. I urged for more science to be done. I did not say, in fact, quite the opposite. I said this does not prove a causal association between the vaccine and the syndrome described. Further work needs to be done. Now, let me just bring you right up to date, Graham, with the science that has been done. This is the latest analysis of all of the studies that have been performed. 136 papers that have looked at this. And this is by Peter McCullough, one of the great experts in this country in infectious disease and COVID in particular, and Nick Hulsher. And the conclusion is this: combination and early timed routine childhood vaccination constitutes the most significant modifiable risk factor for autism spectrum disorder. So in contrast to what that news reporter said, that is the state of the art of the science about this. The cumulative studies that have been performed around the world suggest, they strongly indicate that vaccines are the major indicator or major cause of this condition. And they're modifiable. In other words, they were preventable. This need never have happened. And had they done the appropriate safety studies in the beginning, it would not have happened. But they didn't. They did not. And that's why we are where we are right now.
Johnny.
Andy, I think that's a point to pick up on. They didn't do the double random blind placebo trials that they've done in the other fields of medicine, and they allowed in 1986 an exemption from liability for these vaccine makers. Aaron Siri points this out magnificently in his podcast as a lawyer that deals in facts in courts, deals in a lot of vaccine injury. A lot of these vaccines, these childhood vaccines, have only been tested on 150 kids for 5 days.
Absolutely. If you take the hepatitis B vaccine, to which I believe you're referring, then there is a vaccine that was put out as being safe and effective in neonatal children. This is a vaccine, a purported vaccine for a disease that affects intravenous drug abusers and sexually promiscuous people, not day-old babies. But that was the market because they could not, Merck could not get compliance from those populations. The prostitutes, the drug addicts would not come forward. So they'd created a vaccine and they had no market for it. And they said, and this is what they said at the ACIP meeting, we are not going to have an orphan vaccine. You have to mandate it for infants. And that's what they did. It was a purely commercial move. Were the safety studies done? No randomized placebo-controlled trials at all, nothing in that population, no safety testing in that population whatsoever. And the vaccine was tested for safety for 4 days in the case of one vaccine and 5 in the case of the other. So if your child died 6 days after they'd been given the vaccine, it was nothing to do with the vaccine. You can see how nonsensical this is. And when we look at drugs, pharmaceutical agents that are routinely tested for 15 years, 10 years before they're put onto the market, vaccines got a free pass. And it's not just you're giving a drug to sick people with cancer where you might excuse some problems with safety on the basis that the patient is going to die anyway. You're intending to give it to every healthy child in the world. And therefore, your standard has got to be higher than ever. And they are so desperate. Let me read you something. I think you'll find this fascinating. This is how they see vaccine safety from the other side. This is in a government document, the Federal Register, volume 49, for anyone who wants to look it up, 1984. And this is about the polio vaccine, but it exemplifies the attitude of the system towards vaccine safety. They say, this is the head of the CDC at the time writing this, the FDA, any possible doubts, whether or not well-founded, about the safety of the vaccine cannot be allowed to exist. In view of the need to assure that the vaccine will continue to be used to the maximum extent consistent with the nation's public health objectives. In other words, it doesn't matter what the science is. It doesn't matter how good the science is. How many papers have been published saying it's not safe? It cannot be allowed to exist. That is Orwellian. That is Orwellian, and that is their attitude to all vaccines, and that is the way they approach the COVID vaccine, and that is why we are now in the situation we're in. So if you want an example of how they think and how they behave, you will never see it more clearly than you now see it with the unmasking of Tony Fauci, the lies, the deception, the death from the vaccine, the lack of need for the vaccine, the forcing it on children when the disease is trivial in children with a negligible mortality. So this is where we are now. And there's no point in them getting angry with you and I for having this conversation. They are entirely responsible for the situation in which we find ourselves. They have caused the attrition of public confidence in public health. That's why we are where we are at the moment.
That government quote that you just gave from 1984 in relation to polio, I mean, you could have just virtually lifted that from Fauci's diaries today.
Exactly right.
You know, there were several broadsides fired at you, Andy, Dr. Wakefield, from when those reports started to come out. Let's put the media aside for a moment, although we're going to come back to that. Let's talk about what medical authorities in the UK started targeting you and what did they do?
Well, it began when we had these observations in these children. We didn't know what they meant, but I felt at the time, somewhat naively, that the government would be interested in knowing these results long before they were published. I felt that in the responsible physician would go to the government and say, look, this is what we're finding. Is this something we believe this is something you need to investigate? And I'd done all the safety of the research into the safety, and I went to talk to David Salisbury. David Salisbury was a pediatrician who was in charge of vaccines on behalf of the government. And I said, look, I cannot find the safety studies that compare the single measles vaccine with the triple measles vaccine. Now, why is that important? Because if I gave you 3 blood pressure drugs at the same time, I'd kill you. I'd kill every patient of mine that I put on that regimen. 1 and 1 and 1 don't equal 3. Things potentiate each other, particularly live viruses. And so I said to him, I cannot find these safety studies. Where are they? I'm doing you a disservice if I haven't found them. And he said, we had no reason to assume that the safety of the MMR would be any different from the safety of the single vaccine. In other words, he had made an assumption on behalf of every healthy child in the world vaccinated beyond that point without doing any science whatsoever. What I'd uncovered were papers which showed that there was immunological interference between the viruses in the MMR when they put them together. This was before they put it on the market. They found that the measles component influenced the immune response to the mumps component. The implications for that in terms of safety were completely unknown, but they didn't care. They made the assumption that it would be safe. And so I went out and recommended the single vaccine. What happened next was that the British government withdrew the importation license for the single measles, and in America, Merck unilaterally withdrew the availability of the MMR. So it was our way or no way. And so I spoke to the head of the CDC in England, the equivalent of the CDC, Dr. Elizabeth Miller. And I said, look, if you want to protect children from measles, why would you remove one option for how parents might do that by taking away single measles vaccine? And she said to me, because if we allowed parents the choice, it would destroy our MMR program. In other words, her concerns were not for the children, not for their well-being, but for the protection of the program. And beyond that point, they came after me tooth and nail. They just came at me, and it's a very interesting time, and it's not a hard luck story, just a fact of life. But now we're very, very familiar with the cancel culture, how even the most eminent physicians, the most widely published physicians, are totally expendable if they criticize vaccination policy in the context of COVID. Hundreds of good physicians, great physicians, have had their careers destroyed because they stood up for what was they believed to be morally and scientifically correct. But at that time, there was me. There was just me, this sort of young surgeon, and then on the other side, there were the drug companies and the governments of the world and the World Health Organization and UNICEF and the American Academy of Pediatrics, and so it goes on. So it was somewhat overwhelming. Then you had the media on top of it, particularly run by James Murdoch's son, Rupert Murdoch's son, James Murdoch. And they came after me in the biggest way. There was never any proof of fraud whatsoever. It was purely the allegations of a journalist. And I'll tell you one story that was I've never told this story before. It was fascinating. I sued Brian Deere because it was defamatory. And we got to depose him. Under American law, you get a pre-trial deposition. We got to depose Brian Deer, the deputy editor of the British Medical Journal, and a few others in London. And the lawyers flew over from America, sat down and interviewed the deputy editor who had been responsible. Jane Smith was her name. She was responsible for looking at the 6 million word transcript of the General Medical Council, our trial, my trial, with John Walker Smith and others, and to compare that with what the allegations Brian Deer had made. And it came to the question, were you aware that Dr. Wakefield had testified at the General Medical Council? These are hostile proceedings. Every side gets to present their case. Were you aware of that? She said, no. I had given the longest testimony in the history of the General Medical Council, and she had not read a word of it. She had read not a word of the defense against Brian Deer's allegations. And my lawyer said to her, were you aware that Professor John Walker Smith testified before the General Medical Council, Dr. Wakefield's colleague? And she said, I'm not sure, I don't know. And he had given also the longest testimony in the history of the General Medical Council. Hundreds and hundreds of pages she had completely ignored in evidence and had selected exclusively what the journalists had written without checking the facts. But when it went public, that paper said, we relied upon the 6 million word transcript of the GMC to fact check our allegations against Dr. Wakefield. That was a complete lie. Wow. And at that point, her lawyer, who had come over from Australia, stood up, closed his computer, and walked out of the room. You never lie to your lawyer, and they had lied to their lawyer. They had told him they had done something that they hadn't, and they were going to lose the case. And the next thing we got was a completely amended affidavit, which he obviously went to them and said, either you pull something out of the hat right now, or this case is over. You've lost it because you lied to me. You lied to us. And so we're not able to defend you any longer. And I don't know quite how the conversation went, but I do know that we got this amended affidavit, but a few days later, there was one mention of the General Medical Council transcript, which was what they relied on for the entirety of their previous allegations. So it was over for them. The allegations of fraud were a complete bust. And the problem for us is that ultimately the judges ruled against us in this country, in America. They wouldn't allow us jurisdiction. So the trial never got to be heard on its merits. And that was another story. But you can see how the system is really stacked against you when they are determined to prove a case. That's what happened.
That blew the next question out of the water for me, Dr. Wakefield, which was where did the GMC get it wrong in your case? And it clearly, that's clearly evident by everything you've just admitted. And we thank you for revealing that to us here today.
My pleasure.
Clearly, the media have a major role to play, not only in this whole disaster around MMR and autism, but around vaccines in general. And there's more information coming out now that would have even the most ardent pro-vaccination person starting to scratch their head and wonder if they weren't living in denial, that is. How important is it for media and people in the media like Andrew Bolt, who is a professional journalist? He gets paid for what he do. We're amateurs. Even before we interviewed Aaron Siri, I spent 18 hours listening to the Plotkin deposition twice. And what I looked at was somebody that made Joseph Mengele look like a kindergarten kid. And I wonder if some of these journalists might not take a weekend out to look at some of this stuff so we can get some action happening. How culpable are legacy media organisations around the world in the death of children? I know that's a harsh question, but we've got to put it in that light.
The problem is the wealth and the determination of the vaccine manufacturers. What happened, and you alluded to it earlier, is that in 1986, the act came in, that the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act, which took away liability from the manufacturers for death and injury caused by vaccines on the routine schedule in the US. In other words, what they could do was to put a vaccine on the market, relatively untested, in some cases almost totally untested, and as long as it was approved for the childhood schedule, then they had no liability for death and injury caused by that. All they could do was to make a profit, because the vaccines were mandated for school attendance and there was no liability. They had the perfect business model. And when they got that, they became immensely wealthy. And they launched a whole bunch of new vaccines onto the market, including the hepatitis B vaccine, which Donald Trump has just had removed for children, recommended in his executive order. And when they became immensely wealthy, they bought everybody. And this is where it comes to the media. They bought the mainstream media. If you look at the television, the nightly news networks in the United States, then there are the great majority of the ads are pharmaceutical industry ads. The networks rely for their lifestyle, if you like, on the benevolence of the pharmaceutical industry, from the money coming in. So they own the media. They own medical schools. They started to control medical school training. They owned doctors. Doctors would be seduced and rewarded for compliance with their products, for giving their products. They got bonuses for meeting vaccine targets. So the media were just part of that parcel that were wrapped up by this act and given to the pharmaceutical companies. And so they could say pretty much what they want. And Del Bigtree talks about this extremely well. We made the movie Vax together. And Del came from mainstream media. He came from the doctor's TV program. And when the vaccine issue with autism broke, he was as a producer, senior producer, he went to the doctors and said, "We really need to do a segment on this." And they said, "Absolutely not. If we do a segment on this, then our sponsors, the pharmaceutical companies, are going to withdraw their funding." In other words, the television program was controlled by the pharmaceutical companies who were paying for it. It's entirely predictable. And so that's the situation that we face. That's the situation the world faces, is if you look at the mainstream media, you are going to get their side of the story, just like that garbage that came out of the mouth of that TV presenter you put on earlier.
And I'm pretty sure, Andy, that the majority of people watching this wouldn't believe that a vaccine for children could be tested on a cohort as low as 150 kids and then introduced 4 or 5 days after. I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous. And when you look at the Amish or what they're doing in other countries like Japan, all that is obviously ignored.
Yeah, people around the world, different countries have a very different approach to this. The Norwegians, the Swedes have a very much more relaxed attitude. In particular, parents get to make the choice, and there is informed consent, and that is absolutely essential. Make vaccines available, but also give parents fully informed consent. And that means telling them the truth about all the risks and all the benefits of the vaccine, not lying to them, not giving them your potted version of the truth or condensing it into the benefits and ignoring the risks. So that's where we need to be. And a large part of what Trump recommended the other day was handing that choice back to parents. It should never have been taken away. There should never, ever be a mandated medical procedure. It should not happen. There is no excuse for it. And Nazi Germany taught us that. So, excuse me. Yeah, I think that it's going to change. I know it is changing. You might want to talk about how this is going to go forward, but I think that this is going to be one from the bottom up. People are going to see the truth. They're going to see sense. They're not going to trust what they've been told by public health officials, having now witnessed the lies and obfuscation of Tony Fauci and others, that they are going to demand answers, and they are going to say, I'm not going to follow your recommendations until you have shown me the science and the evidence that I need to see as a parent to make that choice. But parents must have the choice.
I'm pretty certain that the presenter who we showed earlier in the opener will be watching this, because we're actually targeting him, Andrew Bolt. We make no apology for that. Why are we targeting you? Is it to ridicule you, or is it to get you to see common sense and investigate things from another perspective? That would be really, really good. Dr. Wakefield, does it surprise you, and should it surprise anyone, that here in Australia, the FDA in Australia, the Therapeutic Goods Administration in Australia, the TGA, is 96% funded by the big pharmaceutical companies? Should that be of concern?
Absolutely. I mean, you've got the box looking after the hen house. How can that be a good thing? How is that even conscionable in any civilized society? I mean, it's staggering. But the trouble is, what they do is they buy off the physicians, they buy off the experts, and then the experts are put onto the committees. And they say, oh, we have to do that because there are so few experts. But those experts have already been bought off. So make it a condition. If you want to come onto this committee, you do not accept pharmaceutical industry funding. And if you do not come onto this committee. And in the absence of the committee, then recommendations cannot be made, and you don't introduce new products like new vaccines until you have rectified the situation.
And I think just to make the point here, and what Andy's just said there is 100% correct in regard to these experts being bought off. But unfortunately, what happens in a judicial sense is we see that these same experts who are revered but also captured end up being experts for the prosecution in the Crown in these cases, and the judges say, oh, well, these people are experts in their field, and they accept the testimony of these people without looking at the back of house arrangements that are in place, the multi-million, sometimes billion-dollar endorsements or fundings to universities and the like.
And that's the reason why we are where we are. That's the reason that the distrust and the confusion exists and is growing day by day. It used to be, until recently, until COVID, the percentage of the population who trusted the decision-making of the Centers for Disease Control was 80% in this country. It is now 30%.
Wow.
And after Tony Fauci's testimony, or lack of testimony, the other day, it will be around 15%, and it is falling and falling. And once again, may I make it absolutely clear that who is entirely responsible for that are the regulators themselves. The combination of the regulators and the pharmaceutical companies that the regulators are meant to be overseeing, but who are actually in bed with. It's entirely their fault. So don't blame us for having this conversation, for discussing these issues.
Yeah.
Because they're extant. They are here and face us now, and we need to address them.
Dr. Wakefield, part of the arsenal arrayed against you were the scientific medical journals, the scientific journals, peer-reviewed journals that were arrayed against you like a barrage. We cannot, it seems today, trust the medical journals. We're told to trust the science. How can we ever have faith in the medical journals when even their own editors are saying that they can't be trusted?
We can't. I mean, I used to, but I've realized that they are self-interested once again. They are funded by the pharmaceutical companies. They are very much they're foot soldiers of the pharmaceutical companies. So the answer is that we can't trust them.
Well, in the past 20 years, several of their editors and researchers have made public comment about that, and we've got some slides up there. And I think it would be great if you read from the tiles that we're about to present with you from editors of various medical journals.
Certainly. Okay, this is Marcia Angel, former editor-in-chief of the New England Journal of Medicine. And she says, it is simply no longer possible to believe much of the clinical research that is published, or to rely on the judgment of trusted physicians or authoritative medical guidelines. I take no pleasure in this conclusion, which I reached slowly and reluctantly over my 2 decades as the editor of the New England Journal of Medicine. Now, what's alarming about that is, of course, she waited until she had resigned or retired from the New England Journal before she made that claim. But she'd been there for 2 decades, knowing with increasing awareness that this was falling apart, that her journal was publishing science that had no value whatsoever, and said nothing about it.
Let's roll a couple more there, and we'll get you to read those as well.
This is Richard Horton, who's editor-in-chief of The Lancet. Much of the scientific literature, perhaps half, may simply be untrue. Afflicted by studies with small sample sizes, tiny effects, invalid exploratory analyses, and flagrant conflicts of interest, together with an obsession for pursuing fashionable trends of dubious importance, science has taken a turn towards darkness. Richard Horton certainly helped in that process when publishing a lot of the spurious COVID literature that really took the treatment away from effective therapies for COVID. He must be held responsible for that.
Wow, there's at least another half a dozen slides we could read there, but that's all available. We'll make those slides available in the comments section. But clearly, we were told during the COVID pandemic, you have to trust the science. You have to trust the science. And when we questioned the science, we were told there is no data to support your allegations. Now the data's out there in bucket loads. We had Sherry Markson, who is another reporter on Sky News here in Australia, rightfully coming out only the other day, bemoaning the fact that doctors were vaccinating pregnant women. And the CDC in America and various other organisations, including here in Australia, they're still recommending it. They were saying that pregnant women should get vaccinated. Now, that's led to a decline in the birth rate. There have been failed pregnancies. One leading obstetrician gynaecologist here in Australia, Dr Luke McClendon, raised the topic with the board of the hospital that he was chiefing at, and they admitted that the cohort that he presented were being adversely affected by vaccines. I think it was 73 of his vaccinated patients were having failed pregnancies. He ended up selling sheds and pergolas. He lost his job. I believe he may be back at work now. So it's vitally important. While Sherry Markson reported on that the other day, and we applaud her for that, here's the thing. These concerns have been raised for the last 6 years. How many destinies have been snuffed out in the last 6 years while reporters for these news organisations have failed to come to their senses the way some of them are starting to do now? That's something that they need to weigh up. That's something that they need to consider. The Sherry Marksons, the Andrew Bolts, even dare I say the Carl Stefanovics of this world, who's now made a shift. These journalists need to come to terms with the fact that children have been dying, people have been dying, and all we're wanting to do is ask the question, what's causing all the rapid increase in cancers that we're seeing in the under 35 cohort? Everybody's saying, oh, it's not the vaccine, but we don't know what it is. Well, clearly, this needs to be thoroughly investigated. Where do we go from here, Andy Wakefield, given the plethora of data that's been released at the moment? Where do we take this to bring remedy to the world, to the people of the world who are staggering to come to terms with the fact that they've been duped in such a way?
Well, in the absence of the science of safety and efficacy, the vaccine should be stopped, particularly the mRNA-based shots. They should be stopped completely. They shouldn't be available. They should be stopped, and the safety needs to be demonstrated before they are allowed anywhere near the market again. They were rushed to market. It was a huge mistake. The science was not done, and now the public are paying the price. And anyone, as you say, who raises this issue is at risk of losing their job. Well, we now know the truth. It's emerging. Everything that people said, urging caution over the years, has borne out, and there's far more to come. But while that doubt remains, this shot needs to be completely removed from the market, and there should be the development of no further mRNA-based technologies for so-called vaccines at all until a great deal more work has been done. And only then parents should be given absolute choice. There should be no coercion. This should apply to adults as well. No coercion, no forcing, no threats, no fines, and it should be entirely up to the individual whether they want to take that risk or not, or take a risk with the disease. That is our right. So that's what needs to happen. Will that happen? No. And sadly, many more people will be hurt before this issue plays out. But it's going, as I say, it's going to change from the bottom up. It's not going to change from the top down. One thing that I did do, and when my career effectively came to an end around 2010, I became a filmmaker. And over the years, people had come to me from the industry, from the vaccine industry, or from government agencies with extraordinary stories. They said, we have committed fraud, and here is the evidence, and handed it over, the evidence. And I decided to turn these into film, and that's what I did. And one of the films that really made a huge impact was a story that really affected me personally, and that was the MMR vaccine study performed by the CDC. And this really characterizes the mindset of these people. I went to the CDC back in 2010, and I said, earlier, 2000, and they said to me, Dr. Wakefield, every child gets MMR, only a few children get autism. How do you explain that? And I said, well, there are cofactors. Not a lot of people smoke, only some develop lung cancer. How do we explain that? There are cofactors, we don't know what they are. But I believe that for vaccines, age of exposure is critical. The younger you get the MMR, the greater the risk of a bad reaction and regression into autism. Because we know with natural measles, if you get it under 1, you're at greater risk of a serious outcome than if you get it over 1 when it's trivial. And we now know from COVID that age of exposure is critical. In the case of COVID, the older you are when you get the disease, the greater the risk of a bad outcome. So age of exposure and viruses is a major determinant of the outcome. And they said, okay, we're going to test that hypothesis. They went away to Atlanta, they tested it, and they found it to be absolutely true. And they spent the next 14 years destroying the data, altering it, and publishing a paper exonerating MMR. They destroyed the documents, all of them, but one. And that was the lead author, Dr. William Thompson. And Dr. William Thompson, who designed the study and collected the data, done the analyses, kept the documents because he knew it was illegal to destroy them. And this fraud went right to the top of the CDC. And he's 14 years later, he came to a colleague of mine and said, I can no longer live with this, with what we've done. We committed fraud, put millions of children at risk. Here is the evidence. I kept it because I knew it was illegal to destroy it. And it was upon that evidence that we made the movie Vax. And it outright accused them of fraud, which is unambiguous. It was there, it was. MMR was causally associated with autism, and age of exposure was a major risk factor. And he wrote to me, he wrote and said, we could have saved your career if we'd been honest. So nobody knows, so we made the movie Vaxxed. And it changed the world. It really did have a profound impact globally on people's perception of the vaccine. And the other side, naturally, the media, mainstream legacy media, said, oh, you just made this up. Well, let me assure you that we accuse those senior CDC scientists of egregious fraud. If there'd been one word of a lie, one word that was false in what we'd put out there in that movie, we would have been sued to the moon and back again. There was not a whisper, not a single whisper, because they knew it was true. So, have the science shown that MMR vaccine causes autism? Yes, it has. Yes, it absolutely has. So don't tell me, you on Sky Television that it hasn't been done, because it has. Sad thing is that it was covered up and children were put at risk of serious permanent neurological disease in order to protect the scientists at the CDC and their vaccine program. And that is the truth.
And that's what we're seeing, aren't we? We're seeing cover-ups to protect commercial interests. Or go back to the Tess Laurie video, letter to Andy, where she exposed the dreadful situation about how data had been manipulated to allow for the emergency use authorisation of the mRNA vaccines because there was nothing else allegedly that was available, like the hydroxychloroquine and the ivermectin.
Yeah, those potentially life-saving therapies that were entirely approved, have been around for a very long time, were over the counter in many cases, were denied to patients, and patients died as a consequence because Tony Fauci wanted a vaccine and a vaccine only. In other words, you couldn't get emergency use authorization unless if there was anything on the market that was therapeutically beneficial. I mean, it was an absolute disgrace.
And Professor Angus Dalgleish, Andy, has made the comment here to us that he believes the mRNA products will end up making thalidomide look like a pimple on your backside. What are your thoughts?
Oh, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, it's already done that. Once we analyze the numbers, we're going to find that everybody I know has got some family member or themselves who've developed a turbo cancer, who dropped dead on a sports field, who's got permanent cardiac muscle injury, who are just so many that it's cumulative. It goes on and on and on. And the more you get, the more doses you get, the worse it gets. So I'm staggered that we're so blind after all these years to the vagaries of the pharmaceutical companies and corrupt politicians and corrupt regulators. It's absolutely staggering. And it will never be this is the thing, is the public will never trust them again. It's gone forever. Once you lie to people, once you put their families at risk, them at risk, they will never give you their trust again. You have destroyed public trust in public health infrastructure. That's what you have done, you people. And God help us.
Well, it's not only public trust in health. The climate agenda, the net zero policies that are going on around the world, bringing nations to their knees, is all based on science that we're told to trust. This transcends all the institutions that we've relied on over the years to tell us what we need to know in order to live responsibly. We can't trust any of it anymore. So what do you say to people, Andy? And we'll let you go after that. What do you say to people who say, look, let's move on from COVID. It's not a vote winner anymore. It's not a sexy topic anymore. We need to be talking about other stuff now. What do you say to them?
I'm a filmmaker, Graham, and there are a lot of very, very good films that are going to come out about this. I just watched a film about the Second World War, about the trial of Hermann Goering at Nuremberg. You think this isn't going to come out? You think for your convenience to exonerate you, to take the spotlight off you, this isn't going to go on coming out? I tell you, as a filmmaker, as a dramatist, there are a million stories in this that will be told. Will be told. The public will be reminded time and time again of what happened in this decade, and this shameful decade of public health. and they will not forget.
Well, it goes way back. I mean, we had the thalidomide scandal, the pelvic mesh scandal, the dreadful situation around the infected blood scandal that saw great prominence in the UK in particular in the last decade or so with the inquiry over there. These victims are still lying wounded on the battlefield, and to consider that we need to move on because it's no longer sexy to cover it. What happens to all the people that are left behind? We don't want to come to a 50-year apology cycle later on where a new batch of bureaucrats and politicians apologise for the mistakes of the others. We need remedy now, don't we?
We do. I'm so glad you brought that up. And we didn't plan this, but this is an issue that really haunts me. And for those children, for example, who have autism, are now aging out, their parents are becoming infirm and dying. What happens to them? Who is going to care for those individuals? And I just published a book, The Bequest, on this very topic. It's a novel. It deals with this specific issue. What happens when we are no longer there to look after our children? And it's a Western, but it really brings this point home, because there are millions and millions of parents around the world, 9 million families in America alone, every night saying, what happens when we are no longer around to care for our child? So those people injured and left, as you point out, on the battlefield in man's often futile attempt to control infectious disease, someone is going to have to care for them. It is going to fall to the taxpayer, and we better get used to that idea now.
Well, I'll tell you what, that's quite relevant, that comment you just made, because in Perth, I think about a year ago, there was a prominent couple, well-to-do couple living in a leafy suburb of the city of Perth in Western Australia. They had 2 severely autistic sons that they raised, and it was destroying them. They just couldn't manage it. And the end result was that the father, it would appear, took the lives of those boys and his wife and himself, and it appears that the parents agreed that was the only out for them, was to just kill the family.
I've seen this so many times. Loving parents who just reach a breaking point and they think, since no one is going to be around to look after my children, when we go, we take them with us, and suicide is the way they choose. It's absolutely tragic, and it should never have happened.
Final comment for Dr. Wakefield, John?
Well, only to say, I think what we've seen here is a very measured response, Dr. Wakefield. I mean, I don't think anyone could imply from this interview that you're anti-vax at all. In fact, from my, absorption of what you've said, you've said we need to review what's going on, and we certainly need to expose the back-of-house fraud that's been happening for years, and informed consent. It's got to be put back to the people responsible, the parents.
Absolutely. And a message for mothers is, please trust your instincts. I was presented years ago with 2 competing sets of ideas, one from the experts in autism, God save us from experts, and one from the parents. And on every count, every single count, the experts have been wrong and the parents have been right. So I would say to the mothers out there in particular, please trust your instincts. They're there for a reason. They're the most powerful evolutionary force on this planet. Mothers know their children better than anyone else, certainly better than the men and the women in white coats who purport to know them. So trust that instinct. It's served you well. It'll continue to serve you well. And it's certainly shaped my thinking in medicine and in autism in particular.
Dr. Wakefield, one final very brief question. I'm certain, absolutely certain in my faith and trust in humanity that Andrew Bolt, the presenter who castigated you on a program that was seen by, I think, a few people, I think he's still got a few viewers, would be itching to get you on his program to discuss these matters with you. Would you be willing to talk to him?
I will certainly entertain that idea.
Well, there you go, Andrew Bolt. The ball's in your court, my friend. And you know what? If you did interview Dr. Wakefield and give him the credibility that he now deserves, given the evidence coming out, it might redeem you in the eyes of a great many people who trust you or used to. So with that, we'd like to thank you so much, Andy Wakefield, for coming on. You've mentioned God a couple of times, which is great for me because it's my segue to pray at the end of the program, which I always do. I hope you'll indulge me.
Of course.
Dear Lord Father in heaven, we thank you so much for the courage of individuals who stand against the crowd, for those people who are prepared to carry the label of cooker, anti-vaxxer, conspiracy theorist. Lord, we thank you for their courage and the tenacity and the ability that they have to pull some stuff together to bring this to fruition where we can finally examine it and heal our wounded on the battlefield. Lord, we pray for all those victims of past medical scandals, and we pray for the doctors and scientists who are working flat out for remedy as we move forward. And we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Great to have you with us, Dr. Andy Wakefield, and we look forward to talking to you again. I hope we can, and we look forward to seeing you interviewed on the Andrew Bolt Show, the Bolt Report on Sky News.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thanks for joining us. Well, John, that was, I think that clinched it. I guess we're biased because for the last 5 or 6 years we've been dealing with this rubbish and trying to bring some truth and ration and reason and remedy, all the R words that we need to focus on now. I fervently hope that Andrew Bolt and others in the news media will watch this and see it for what it is and start focusing on getting everything back to where it needs to be. I don't know. I thought that was a great interview.
Mate, perfect. And, that is a really good interview for parents to watch. And I didn't get the impression there for one moment that he was anti-vaccines at all. He's pro-safety. He wants to make sure that things are safe. He was obviously doing it at the time, and he's had his entire career, ruined. You could imagine how many people that, would have had a different outcome as a result of his stepping up at the time. But unfortunately, the bureaucracy got hold of it, and we are where we are. But who knows?
Well, look, in the last 6 years, we've done over 600 interviews, and we've interviewed people of the calibre of Dr. Wakefield and many, many others. We've gone from prime ministers right through the ranks. We've spent a lot of those interviews focusing on the vaccine injured and listening to their plight. It's time for remedy now. We keep saying that word, but we must focus on the wounded. While we're all arguing about who's to blame, people are dying, literally dying. And there are a lot of good people out there who are ready to jump back in. The cancellations and the deregistrations need to be lifted. All the people who lost their jobs as a result of mandates need to be back in their field. We're talking about police, and, I was talking with Justin Poore yesterday. He's still waiting to get back into the police force. I love the job. He said, I love it. But, boy, they're making it hard for us to get back. But, we need frontline people that have the strength of their conviction to put all of their love to serve others at risk by saying something's not right. Yeah. There's a rat in the cheese factory. We need them all back. We need all these doctors back. We need all these nurses. Come on, it's time to move on. I think that's the only way we can move on, John.
Well, that's exactly right. There needs to be a wholesale change of how things are done and how things are presented. There just needs to be transparency in all this, and there's not currently, and people will make an informed choice. And I think going forward, if political parties pick up on this, they will do well, because there is a very large, hesitancy to back in bureaucracies now in the light of this COVID mess. And if, we're seeing that, I think, the one nations of the world, if they pick up, which they have been, and say, no, we need reform in this area, then we've got to look at medicine differently. I mean, Ian Brightope, for one, has come up with ideas. These need to be think tanked and tried, because what's happening now isn't working.
That's for sure. Well, we're doing the best we can to push it forward. Now, to that end, I think we can reveal that on the 10th of September, this coming 10th of September in Sydney, at a venue which we will disclose in due course for obvious reasons, we're conducting a public debate. And the purpose of that debate is to bring people from both sides of the narrative to a public forum in a public venue where we can talk about moving forward, learn from the mistakes that we've all made. We've all made them. You know, you and I have made a few gaffes over the years, Johnny, and we need to bring all these people together. So we're going to be inviting prominent individuals in health and other areas. It's not going to be just focusing about COVID and all the rest of it. An invitation will be going out to Dr. Kerry Chant. We're going to be inviting Brad Hazard. We'll find a contact for Brad, and I'm sure we'll welcome him to the stage if he's prepared to come along, or even if he just wants to come along and listen and participate. A lot of great other speakers will be there, and we look forward to promoting that very soon and getting the information out to our people. So, with all that said, Johnny, you've often been heard to say,
you just couldn't make this stuff up.
You couldn't make this stuff up. Stay out of the trees, everybody. Thank you to Tanya Danock. Thank you to Suzanne Burns, to Stuart Robertson, and our mate Rob McKnight for producing this show. He's doing a wonderful job, and he'll be producing the event in Sydney too, John, which will be great.
Yep.
So thank you all for watching us. Stay tuned for the next Bullseye episode coming your way very soon. God bless you all, Australia, and bye for now.